BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Hello and welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at changing points in history. And boy, today we've got a big turning point ahead of us. And I'm very glad to welcome Anton Howes as my guest. Anton, welcome. And we've been trying to schedule this podcast for a while, and we've had to delay it for the best possible reason. You've become a father. Congratulations.
That's right. Thanks very much. Thank you.
You can still get to sleep sometimes and to record podcasts.
Yeah, definitely.
And you even do something that always makes me blanch with envy. You're one of those people who have time to do a Substack. I don't know where people take that time from. They're usually very busy people, but they still manage to produce pages and pages of well-considered arguments just in their spare time. Your podcast is called The Age of Invention, and that sort of leads us to our topic, which is one of the really big questions of modern history, one that has been debated for a long time and that is now have basically come back as a topic because the frame of reference has changed a bit. And that question is one of those beautiful, naive questions that a 6-year-old might ask. Why did the Industrial Revolution happen? And why did it happen in Britain? And why did it happen at that time? And that really is a fascinating question, especially if you know that so many technologies that were key to the Industrial Revolution, so many materials that were key to or perhaps all the materials that were key to the Industrial Revolution had been around for roughly, 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. The Romans had been technologically much more advanced than we give them credit for. That's archaeologists are unearthing their technological sophistication as we speak. The Chinese had been technologically hugely advanced, much more than Europe for a very long time.
Yeah, especially during the Song dynasty. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And Europe was really, as I sometimes try to argue, really one of the least good candidates for this kind of development to happen. It was go back to the sort of 15th, 16th century, yes.
You can say there's bits of Europe that look like good candidates. Like if I were an extraterrestrial visiting...
Yeah, but that's northern Italy, perhaps, or...
Yes, northern Italy, the Low Countries, perhaps. So the Burgundian ruled, and then Habsburg ruled the Low Countries. So what's today the Netherlands and Belgium, Luxembourg, that kind of Benelux area.
But northern England would not have been.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think it's one of those things I love to harp on about. I'm working on a book right now, and chapter upon chapter, actually, right at the beginning, has been about how rubbish England was, or how unlikely a candidate England was, how bad things had been getting in England.
How bad were they?
I'll put it this way. England's urbanisation rate at the time, in around 1500, is a bit lower than that of Poland at the time, Poland-Lithuania at the time. Right, so it's a very agricultural economy. It's very much a backwater. There's pretty much everywhere you can think of in Europe is more advanced, unless we're talking about these very peripheral regions, right? So Poland, Lithuania, where it's kind of turning into steppe land. Scandinavia is kind of similar. The way that we might think of Scotland in the 17th, 18th centuries being this kind of rural periphery is the way we should think about the whole of Britain, right, in that period. London is a capital city.
You make a fascinating point. Sorry to interrupt you, but just because it throws us back a little bit, and I want us to also go ahead because we really, of course, want to get into the meat of it in the 18th and 19th centuries. But you make a very important point that part of that backwardness of Britain in what is basically already the time of the Italian Renaissance, they've already been busy with that for 100 years, had to do with the Black Death. 14th century, mid-14th century, of course, huge social changes because the populations were devastated. People like to say decimated, but that's actually reduced by 10%. They were much more than decimated. They were halved in many areas. And that in Britain had a particular consequence of repressive legislation.
Yeah, and what you also see is that England demographically falls far behind the rest of Europe. I think the only similar country might be what happens in Norway. Um, France recovers its population pretty quickly. It is not as quick as it could be because of the Hundred Years' War, which is English armies marauding all over the place, Burgundian armies as well often. But it recovers pretty quickly. You see recovery pretty much everywhere in Europe, except for in England. The population stays incredibly stagnant for the entire 15th century. I mean, when people talk about the Wars of the Roses being this kind of big civil war in the 15th century, I think it's more accurate to think of the Wars of the Roses as being a very weak, much reduced England being at the mercy of foreign powers, right? Because nearly every time you've got a change of power, it involves foreign mercenaries being sent by a foreign ruler, either the King of France or the Duke of Burgundy, and then kind of, going back and fro between the two of them, right? Nearly every change of power that you see involves some kind of foreign-backed invasion, usually a kind of amphibious landing in England and an army marching hundreds and hundreds of miles until it's then met finally by another army, usually in the middle of the country somewhere, right? So we think of England as being this kind of impregnable island nation, but that's absolutely not the case in the 15th century. It's extremely weak. It's only in the 16th century that you start to see recovery to that pre-Black Death level. And then in the mid-16th century and kind of then the time of Shakespeare around 1600, that you start to see England kind of looking quite interesting because it's suddenly surpassing those old levels. Not only is the population recovering, but the population is doing very different things. It's much more urban. It's much more concentrated, particularly on London. But some of the other cities are growing as well. And in some ways, I wouldn't even say that England is urbanizing. I would say it's Londonizing, right? The population of London was about 50,000, even then, right? Even then. But this is actually the crucial point at which England becomes very London-centric. London had always been the biggest city by far, but within this very, very agricultural context, right, where basically everyone works in agriculture. 70, 80% of the population is reliant on agriculture. You do have textile production, but very much something that happens a lot of the time in the home. You have certain counties that are devoted towards it, but it's a very, very rural population. To the extent that there's industry, you've got a huge wool export industry, and then to an extent you've got cloth export industry as well. But they're not even kind of producing the finished product, right? They sell a lot of unfinished woolen broadcloth to the Low Countries, where all of the extra bits that turn it into a high value item get done.
In brackets, just quickly, though, the wool export takes us into Karl-Polanyi territory, takes us to the enclosure of the commons, takes us to a great social change that happened there. Is that, am I wrong to make that connection?
Yes and no. I wouldn't talk about enclosure of the commons as such at the time.
Wasn't that a lot done for landowners to rear sheep for wool production rather than for people's own needs, for small farmers' own needs?
Right, you've got conversion of arable to pasture happening quite a lot. But enclosure means lots of different things at different periods of time. So in the 18th century, 19th century, I think I'd be more comfortable talking about enclosure of the commons.
It's that late, because Polanyi really makes that something that happens in the 16th, 17th century.
I think he's going off some kind of outdated information now. We know a lot more.
Okay, no, that's really interesting.
To give you an example of just how complicated it gets, in 1549, you've got the Kett Rebellion, and people talk about it as being an anti-enclosure riot, which it is. But if you look at their first demand, like top of the list of 20 or so things, is actually to preserve certain enclosures, right? Because there are circumstances where tenant farmers are enclosing land for a high value crop. Like the first demand is to do with saffron, so a very high value crop. And what's happening is that the lord of the manor is saying, no, I have the right to get my cattle and go through your land and graze on that land. So enclosure can be quite tricky situation. It really varies by locality. It really varies about, very noisy picture. Sometimes enclosure is something that happens entirely voluntarily, right? You can get unanimity within the village. People just buy up all of the plots of land, and then the manor ceases to exist as an institution that regulates what people can and can't do with the land. And so the kind of removing it from manorial jurisdiction is kind of, I'd say, if we want to really get technical, the legal definition of enclosure is that it's placing land into severalty, removing the ability of the manorial court, presided over by the lord of the manor, to regulate what can and can't be done with the land. And even the way people think about commons, right? We have this kind of, I think, very almost 20th century idea of what the commons are being projected back onto it.
Well, I obviously do, yes.
Well, I think it's a very common understanding, even amongst a lot of historians as well, because especially, I mean, a lot of this goes back to history that was done in the mid 19th century. Oh, excuse me, and then kind of got repeated and continued to be cited since. But my best analogy that I've been able to come up with for what the commons would resemble today is a bit like residence parking permits. It's not about a free-for-all that everyone gets to use the land. It's very much that there's certain rights that belong to residents, and they don't like other people impinging on those rights. And so it's, if you had a council that came in and said, a local authority came in and said, we're going to remove, all these residence parking permits, or put up the price of permits, or, even restrict who's allowed to get them. That's the kind of annoyance that people are feeling about enclosure. They're saying, well, hang on, I've always had this. This is my customary rights to park here, and it's only for me and not for anyone else. Because agriculture is, you're really cheek by jowl with a lot of other people about what can go on, where you can bring your cow, where your sheep are allowed to graze, at what times of year, which trees are you allowed to chop branches off for your fuel, which patches of marshland are you allowed to dig for turf, different times of year, different numbers of things that can happen. One of the big complaints in the 16th century, talking about these really early, often referred to as the Tudor enclosures, is about grazing rights. It's the complaint against the landlords is often that they are abusing the grazing rights. They're putting too much cattle on the land. There's overgrazing going on, and so the balance is starting to be distorted.
That was a lovely parenthesis. We were actually with wool production as a sort of precursor to industrialization. But let's hop right in, because you make an argument, and you triumphantly write on your Substack as well, that an argument of this ilk just got a Nobel Prize for economics, Joel Mocha, because he is one of those economic historians who believe that ideas are actually important in this process, that it's not just about materials available and market forces and technologies and technological tinkering, but that there is a way of understanding the world that becomes an important thing. I've done quite a lot of work and written about the Encyclopédie by Diderot and d'Alembert, which seems to me to be a fine example of that, because here you have an Enlightenment project done by effectively gentlemen. I mean, Diderot didn't have money and didn't come from a genteel family, but, it was the sport for the educated, well-heeled to do this kind of thing. But they write a 28-volume work mainly about the crafts, mainly about what's useful, what people do constructively, what they do innovatively, how they construct a new world, and they detail all those things that never had the dignity to appear in print. They show you every little tool in French. Yes, they publish it in France, so forgive them for writing it in French.
No, but I'm saying they had the dignity in other languages, I think. But in French, certainly, it's the first time I think they've got this big shift in that.
That's true. But also, I think, not just as an isolated study of a craft, but as this is what's important in the world. This is the whole world. And this is what we, the Academy of the Intellectuals, think is what really matters in the world. And what do you know? It's industrial crafts, it's machines, it's instruments, it's practical knowledge, it's mathematics. And that I mean, you can ask why then didn't the Industrial Revolution hit France before it hit England? But there's something really important in here, which I'd like to enlarge on, which is the relationship between savant and fabricant, between the people who know stuff and the people who make stuff.
Yeah, I think that actually gets to the heart of that question you just asked. Why not France? Why Britain first? So I'll say two things. I think we need to be really careful with the chronology. When we think about the Industrial Revolution, most people they go, "Oh yeah, I learned about that at school. It's about 1760 to 1830 thereabouts," and you can kind of adjust by a few decades either side. I think that's completely wrong. I think the Industrial Revolution is very obviously in full swing in Britain by 1700. Right? I think if you look at the way that foreigners talk about Britain in 1700, it's clear that they're worried about something going on technologically. The French are sending industrial spies, the Russians are sending industrial spies, the Spanish are sending industrial spies, the Dutch are kind of very curious about what the hell's just gone over there, given the Dutch stadtholder is still the king, is already the king of England. A lot is going on technologically in Britain, which didn't make its way into the textbooks over the course of the 20th century in terms of the famous technologies that you hear about. But there is actually quite a lot going on there already.
Such as,
well, we can talk about the very early steam engines being developed in the 1690s and 1710s, not having as big an impact yet. But we can also talk about there's quite a lot of mechanization going on in textiles already. You've got things like steam treatment of timbers for making ships. It's very obscure, but actually incredibly useful. You've already got this quite a lot of agricultural improvement going on. You've already got significant coal usage across loads of different industries before the use of the steam engine.
And in London, as I read from you, that the shift to coal for heating homes and therefore the shift to appalling fog and smog as we would today was actually around 1600 and not in the Victorian days.
Right, so coal at London, there's a big shift happens 1580 to 1600. I've done quite a bit of work uncovering the fact that there seems to be a shift towards using coal in brewing, may actually be the thing that leads to it. And then once coal starts being dug in much greater quantities in Newcastle, they discover that there's this much what they call great coal. It's basically just bigger rocks of coal the further they dig down, which is much more suitable for burning in people's hearths in the home.
When is that, may I ask?
So that's around 1580 to 1600. That's when they make this discovery.
A slightly wild and weird question. Does it have anything to do with the Little Ice Age? I've written about that, and it appears to me, I mean, we have a lot of transfer from wine to beer in that time because it becomes too cold to grow wine. There was also a lot of wine grown in England before that time, before the middle of the 16th century. So, just a little rider question. Is there a secondary impact?
Yeah, probably not, for the simple reason that the technology is actually adopted in England from abroad, and it's developed in the 1550s in Strasbourg. And so the thing I managed to work out is there's actually an international consortium of Germans based around Strasbourg where they've patented this heat-saving technique.
Patented in the 16th century?
Oh, yeah. The Holzersparungskunst, so the wood-saving art, I guess is the way you'd translate it into English. If you look up the Holzersparungskunst, sometimes the Holzersparungskunst, it kind of depends. I'm not really sure if early modern German had these slight differences. There's actually a whole bunch of patents for it. Technically, it's for saving wood, right? It's the wood-saving art. Because in Germany, you have this, very, very severe wood shortage. Like if there's a wood shortage anywhere, it's in Germany, right? So forests are very much taken very seriously because they need it for salt boiling, especially in land. They need it for fuel, for basically everything, right? Everyone is using wood.
Construction material.
And they basically discover a way of recycling some of the exhaust heat to kind of use a kind of indirect heating that way. So the famous German stoves, right, where you kind of have the fire on one side and then the stove is still, you're using the chimney, kind of the inducted heat, conducted. I'm not sure. The heat that's coming via the walls of the chimney into the room is what you're using, right? So that's kind of what the Holzerspannungskunst is. And so in the 1550s, you've got a whole bunch of German inventors, and it appears as though they market it all over Europe. And there's some promotional material that says from England to Constantinople. I haven't been able to find where they were selling it in Constantinople, but they're certainly trying to. They get a kind of their franchisees manage to get a patent for Lithuania, or the permission for Lithuania. They get patents seemingly throughout Italy, although I haven't been able to.
Which was less peripheral than it sounds today, because it was the great Lithuanian dukedom that included most of Poland and Ukraine. So
yes, so although interestingly they don't get Poland, but they do get Lithuania, which was more peripheral within Poland, Lithuania. So they are a bit disappointed that they only get the bit where actually wood is kind of plentiful. It doesn't make as big a difference. But throughout Germany, throughout Italy, they get various local patents. From the Duke of Saxony and so on and so forth, as well as their kind of Reich level patent for the whole of the Holy Roman Empire. Seemingly, there are patents that appear to be their patents in the Low Countries and in France, and then we start to see some of the very earliest patents ever granted. Not the earliest, but some of the earliest patents ever granted in England are for this technique in England. And it takes a while for it to come into effect, but it seems to be late 1570s, early 1580s. One of the groups of these inventors finally manages to get it in place, and it's actually adopted first in the Low Countries. Is that we've got loads of in English surviving in the English archives surviving testimonials from various brewers in the Low Countries saying how great this thing is for saving wood, and inadvertently is my kind of belief, they inadvertently realised that given they're not having direct smoke onto the thing that's being done, they can use coal as well. And so in Britain, where coal is pretty plentiful already, and actually seemingly at the same time kind of near Liège as well, which will have been Aix-la-Chapelle, kind of you see it, so Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle, and kind of near Liège, where you also have coal mines. It appears as though coal is used for brewing as well, because you need to heat up, you need to boil a hell of a lot of water for brewing, and the more there's a lot of heating up and cooling down and heating up again, especially for beer versus ale, which also I think is why beer becomes a big thing in Britain, whereas ale had always been the thing that you used before. So it's not just about the introduction of hops, it's also the extra energy intensivity. So the relative cost of ale and beer suddenly, like relative cost of beer suddenly falls quite dramatically, because there's this huge fuel saving as well. But that brings, it appears, because they only needed kind of waste coal in order to do this kind of industrial stuff, they very quickly exhaust the kind of surface level coal that you have in Newcastle, which had often been used for blacksmiths and actually exported, right? So French blacksmiths importing Newcastle coal well back into the early 16th century. It is in fact the main use of Newcastle coal is for French blacksmiths, right? Continental blacksmiths. You've got all these really early reports from when they're talking about going to war with France in the early 16th century. There's various reports in the state archives.
And they say, I know, we just stopped giving them coal.
Yeah, it's just like we can get the kind of economic warfare proposals are all to do with just stopping the exports of coal, because they say the blacksmiths will just suddenly...
Mark Carney would have something to say about that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the kind of, there's this whole hidden history or kind of forgotten history of what's going on with energy. So England has this very early advantage actually in those respects, and then in the early 17th century, so we're talking 1610s, 1620s, coal is applied to various other things. You start seeing it used in salt making, which means that you don't have to export quite as much from France. You start seeing it used in glass making, which is this sudden, instead of having to import really high cost glass all the way from Venice, or in some cases the less crystal clear stuff, so your green glass, let's say, from France or from the Low Countries, that can suddenly be made within Britain itself. saves a lot of imports, but also creates a whole new industry in England. You see a lot of the pressure on wood supplies, and I think this is actually the most crucial thing. It's not the direct impact, but the indirect impact. You see the relief of pressure on wood supplies for everything else. Basically, you can afford now to have a lot more wood being used for iron making, because they still haven't worked out how to use coal in terms of the kind of actual, casting and forging iron, but they are using it in the kind of blacksmith side of things. So that that would be forging, but they're not using it for making cast or wrought iron, worked iron yet. So that frees up a lot of wood for that. It also frees up a lot of wood because you can start burning coal in people's homes, frees up all that firewood that you'd use in people's homes as well. And all of that land gets converted to agriculture. So you see this kind of explosion of grain abundance, land abundance for pasture as well. By 1700, it's pretty clear.
So they don't preserve the beautiful forests, but they just chop them down and make them into fields.
Before the 20th century, forests only exist as managed landscapes, I think. I mean, this is across the world, really.
People were not sentimental about those resources.
Absolutely not, right? Forests are in direct competition with agriculture, right? This is land that you can be using for grain. It is land that you keep around as forest because it's so useful. And it's the same, I think, with all the other kind of non-arable, non-pasture land. You see it the same with heaths. For example, a lot of the kind of gorse and other vegetation that you see on heaths, that can also be used as fuel. It's kept around often because for that particular reason. The same with marshlands, right? Peat, turf, peat, like these are fuels that you need to keep around. And the moment coal comes in, I had a piece on my Substack called The Coal Conquest. The moment coal starts appearing, all of those landscapes magically start disappearing.
But this is fantastic in the terms of environmental thought today, because we're talking so much about finding our space in the ecosystem Earth and negotiating how we can, where the limits of that space are and how we can live within it. At the moment, not very successfully. And you are describing a situation where people were forced to do that because they had no external resources, and they needed to foster these resources because otherwise they would be without. And now an external resource comes in that completely upsets the system and allows them to erase those resources which are no longer necessary, and therefore have a much bigger impact on the environment.
Yeah, and today we're almost seeing the opposite, right? Is that because we're seeing reforestation in a lot of European countries, I think because the value we get from leisure, from enjoying forests, is much higher than it used to be. But also, food is so abundant that it's not that big a deal anymore. We don't need it all to be agricultural land. We can import it. Yields are so much higher than they once were. Populations aren't exactly expanding at the huge rates that they were at the time as well. If anything, we have declining populations increasingly. So the pressure on resources is going back.
Fantastically declining populations. At present birth rates, I believe in 2300 there will be 3 billion people in the world. That will be a decline of 7 billion within just under 200 years.
Which is, we don't know what society looks like with that kind of decline. Or maybe we do. We saw it with the Black Death, but it was, a kind of natural but a different, more sudden cause.
It is something I think that we will have to study very attentively in the next decades, which is what happens with societies. We're already seeing the overaging of our own societies. We are already seeing people, with the laudable exception of you, having far too few kids.
Well, I need to have another one if I'm to be at replacement. So
well, another 1.1, yes.
0.1, anytime.
Yes. I'll let you work that out for yourself. You can also go to the safe side with 3, just to make perfectly sure. But and of course, at the moment, the big political hot potato of trying to make up with the shortfall in the younger workforce through immigration. which is what's happening. But we will have to think about what happens with society when the social net begins to tear because there are not enough people left. I mean, this is just a sort of, again, a parenthesis looking not into the 16th century, but into the 21st or 22nd, but they're not that far away. Well, the 22nd isn't far away. We're in the other one.
No, I think there's echoes. There are echoes. We've seen what a society can look like with very low birth rates and stagnant population, and it's not pretty as well.
No, but also, look, I think also there's a very fundamental thing, and then we go back to history. But, it does not feel good to live in a country where there are more old people than young people when you don't see children in the street. It does something to a society's sense of its future, I believe. In a non-statistical, very, very subliminal way, but it does something to your sense of a future. And of course, it does something to the political priorities of a society if the majority of the voters are older and more intent on preservation and control than on job creation and looking towards a future. Yes, of course. But back to history, because we were in the relationship between the savant and the fabricant. In other words, here's a sphere of intellectual achievement, of knowledge, that was in the Middle Ages very, very exclusive, and really only happened in the context of the church, that in the Renaissance becomes sort of spills out into the courts and perhaps some libraries and studies, but remains an intensely elitist endeavor. And then there are craftsmen working away, doing their own thing, but there is no meeting between those two worlds. And here we get this meeting, and that turns out to be something fantastically important.
Yeah, and I think so. The point we really took a long route there. The point I was making is Britain is already looking interesting by 1700, and the reason that's important is because I think we need to understand the projects like the Encyclopédie as being about catch up. It's the French going, hang on a second, something really worrying is happening because the old enemy is starting to get very wealthy very fast.
Here's a lovely thing to reconfirm, to give credence to that argument, which is the whole thing started with the translation of an English cyclopedia by Ephraim Chambers, which Diderot translated, and then decided, I can improve on that. And that's how the project got started.
But Chambers' Encyclopedia is actually one of many of these sorts of projects that are happening. They're just not quite as comprehensive, right? So one of the best sources that I love to use all the time for just how industry works in the 1690s is the newsletters by a guy called John Houghton. And he's one of these guys who, you'll read these newsletters and he just goes through. Someone has sent him correspondence and he'll just print the full correspondence pretty much without any corrections of just, this is how malt drying in Derbyshire works. And he'll do it over the course of 3 weeks. And every issue will also have all of the stock prices of all the different companies that are being sold on the London kind of proto stock exchange. It's not quite formalized yet, sort of actually within, it's almost, the stock exchange is itself kind of the publications that are being circulated within coffee houses. And he's got various little classified ads about, you can sell some chocolate for such and such, and I'm looking for some tea, and I'm looking for a job as a servant, but I won't accept wages for any less than XYZ, that kind of thing. And then all the prices all over the country that have been sent to him by his correspondents. This is what the price of wheat is across the country. This is the price of nutmeg in London, that kind of thing. And so a lot of that information is really being printed all the time in England, especially by 1700. But it's already been building up for quite a while before then. And in the 1650s, certainly as well, inspired by the kind of the blueprint that's written out by Francis Bacon in the 1620s, you're already in the 1650s and 60s seeing a lot of these utopians going, we need to do Bacon's project, we need to have these big, vast collections of all human knowledge, but particularly artisanal knowledge, and we need to be getting that out there, because otherwise what happens is, you mentioned, it's not just connections between savant and fabricant. Part of the problem is actually connections between fabricant and fabricant. It's that artisans don't talk to artisans. They keep their trade secrets. They maybe tell their apprentice, they tell their children, their trusted apprentice is kind of, like a son to them, that kind of thing. They pass on their knowledge. But if that knowledge dies with those people, a plague, tears through the countryside, which happens all the time, every 20, 30 years, there's a mass death event in London, pretty much, where they lose about 10, 20, even 30% of the population, which makes its growth even more, impressive when you think about that replacement that has to happen within just a few years. But all of these skills are lost all the time, having to be constantly revitalized.
Of course, printing also makes a vast change to that, because all of a sudden it doesn't get lost.
We think today, I think about printing as being this propagation technology. At the time, I think a lot of people are looking at it as the potential as a preservation technology. It's an archiving technology.
I think they're different uses. I think in Europe, in the religious wars, it was definitely propaganda. And here it was also, printing was important, not for books, but for flyers. Hardly anybody could ever afford to buy a book, but flyers that were illustrated, often pornographic, had a few rhymes on them. That's what people could get.
Yeah, they call them printed libels a lot of the time, and the historians call them, for the 17th century.
Yeah, exactly. But that was the meat of the printing industry, the early printing industry in the religious wars. So that was definitely propaganda. But yes, storing knowledge, accumulating knowledge for the first time.
So it's sort of storing knowledge through having more sources, right? So if a manuscript gets burnt in a fire, that's it. But if you've printed 100 copies and they're all over the country, then at least one of them's going to survive. And we're beneficiaries of that technique, because we often only do have one copy of a certain printed book, and now it's been digitized, and we have all these extra kind of copies being propagated that way as well. So it's not just all within certain libraries. But printing is seen as such. I mean, there's a reason that Francis Bacon's New Atlantis is set in a pre-deluge, surviving society. He's saying, look, there's this society that, fictional society that has survived the Great Flood, and it's because it's doing all this pro-knowledge, stuff. It's because they're accumulating all this stuff and disseminating it, redisseminating it, so that you can preserve all that knowledge. I think he's very much thinking about something similar happening. And you see even stuff around the Reformation as well in the 16th century in England. Even before him, a lot of the people who would have been influences on him, they were going around in the 1540s and 50s, going around all the monastic libraries and trying to make sure that all of the manuscripts were being preserved, because you do get these great flood-like events that try to do that. John Dee, Elizabeth I's magician, but actually, a major mathematician, hugely important mathematician, right? He's one of the guys who really helps the English do voyages of discovery, especially in northern latitudes, where it gets quite complicated mathematically to work out what's going on in terms of setting your course, right? Because the lines of latitude become more like circles the closer to the pole you get, because you need to kind of think around it around the circle, so around the point of the pole. So hugely important mathematician. But one of the things he tried to do was he petitioned saying, can I have a royal license to go around to everyone's libraries and catalogue what's there, and try to form a big royal library where we can actually recollect all this stuff in one place. He's denied, but it is something that he's thinking about in the 1550s. And I think that experience is very much informing a lot of the antiquarians that you see in the late 16th century, which also becomes a thing. There's a whole group of people who are meeting pretty regularly.
Antiquarians in this case are not people who are selling old books, but people who are looking for old texts, old manuscripts in libraries and other places.
They're looking for old texts. They're looking for anything old, really. They're even going into churches and taking, recording what's said on every monument, kind of thing. They're trying to just collect all of that and preserve that knowledge in case it gets lost later on.
Which is a new thing, which is interesting, because at the same moment when we get knowledge preservation in print, we also, for the first time, I believe, in Western history, get the anxiety about things getting lost. We're getting a past that is valuable for its own sake.
For England, I think it's the disestablishment of the monasteries that is the big, like, oh my God, things can really change like that, in the late 1530s, early 1540s. I think it's, for a lot of people who cared about this old stuff, it is like the Great Flood for them. It's like we need to make sure that if that happens again, yeah, and I wonder if that's why antiquarianism, even today, is quite, quite a common hobby in England, right? And I don't know how that compares with other countries.
The old brass rubbings.
Certainly, you have a lot of local historians all over, but people love their brass rubbings. They love collecting their old coins. This has been around for a very, very, very long time, right? Tudors and Stuarts are doing this stuff.
But how interesting! Yes, the connection with the disestablishment of the monarchies. That was such a brutal and traumatic thing. We should really do a conversation about that, because it sounds so genteel, the disestablishment, but destroying hundreds of thousands of monasteries, expelling all the monks.
Expelling all the monks, pensioning them off, which is something that's not often realised, is that they kind of buy them off in a way. They pension them all off. But Henry VIII basically decides, having started what was kind of more of a just rationalisation of monasteries, which happened all the time actually throughout the Middle Ages, the smaller monasteries. There's the Pilgrimage of Grace, which is a big northern rebellion against the break with Rome, and he seems to believe that it's the monks who are responsible for stirring it up. And once he believes it's the monks, he's like, these are the fifth column that must be stamped out, right? They're just going. And I think he's a vengeful guy, Henry VIII. And so I think that desire for vengeance is then fed into by people like Thomas Cromwell, his chief minister, who actually hates the monks for other reasons, for more religious or like intellectual reasons, thinks the monasteries just shouldn't really exist. It's very striking reading material from the 1530s before it actually gets going, where people are talking about the monks as being almost like a kind of class on benefits. They're creaming off all of the hard-working, they're licking the sweat off the poor man's brow kind of thing, you know what I mean? Like they're sitting there getting fat and so on while doing nothing. And because there's all these religious ideas saying, well, maybe they're not that necessary. You don't maybe need to have a whole bunch of people praying for you to get through purgatory as quickly as possible. Doesn't exist. Maybe that's not a thing, So I think there's a lot of that.
All these wonderful connections. Anton, we're getting spectacularly sidetracked all the time, which is delightful.
I should have warned you actually at the beginning that this is extremely common with me, is you have to keep me on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, well, the thing is, it's extremely common with me as well. But I want to get to one lovely phrase that you use, because it's something really important, and it gets us to the why, I think. Well, you say, and we can discuss, and that is the improving mentality, which means people used technologies, for instance, for spinning and weaving for hundreds of years, and they did their job, and they were good enough, and nobody thought about tinkering with them. After all, they were working. Now, all of a sudden, a nation erupts into tinkering. The nation of boffins is not something that the 20th century invented. A nation erupts into tinkering. And you make the point, Mokyo makes the point, some others do, here is a very important causal connection between this thing happening and things like, for instance, scientific societies. And things like Enlightenment thinking, and Enlightenment thinkers were also natural philosophers, meaning they also go into labs and do experiments. And the division between elite knowledge and useful knowledge gets erased, but also you get this idea that what I have is just the beginning of what I could have. Something could be quite different. In other words, the world could be a different place.
Yeah, it's improvable. I think it's seeing room for improvement. One of my favourite examples being a guy called Lancelot Capability Brown. Capability is his middle name in kind of inverted commas, because he'd look out at people's gardens. He's a landscape gardener and say, very capable of improvement.
The landscape gardener.
Right, the landscape gardener, really, but he sees people's gardens and says, very capable, very capable. There's capability of improvement there. There's room for improvement, and it's very much, yes, the improvement mentality is, I think, it's like a kind of mental tick. It's something that people aren't necessarily even switching off or conscious of, but once they get it, and I think they very much catch it from other people through observing what they're doing.
How do they catch it? Why do they catch it at this time?
I think people have always had it. I think it's always been around. You've always had some improvers. You've always had some tinkerers. You mentioned at the beginning, Sung Dynasty China, the Italian Renaissance, the Low Countries in the 15th century. I mean, I think you can definitely see improvers. You can see people with the improving mentality in those periods, in those places, but they're usually quite rare. And because they're rare, the improving mentality doesn't necessarily spread from person to person that easily, right? I think it's typically via quite close personal connections. It's via an apprentice. It's sometimes it could be a son who's interested in what you're doing in the workshop, that kind of thing. Sometimes a brother. It's usually through very close connections, and a lot of what happens in terms of institution building, informal institution building, in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, scientific societies, for example, is about kind of, once you start concentrating a bunch of people who have that improvement mentality, the chances of spread become much greater. It's like you're incubating the kind of mental virus, if you like. That's how I think we need to think about these societies, is that they're egging each other on, right? It's not just, there's one person down in their shed, the boffin, kind of working in private, in secret, while his wife's like, where is he? What's he up to? Like down the shed, you're tinkering with things. We're talking about people who are tinkering. They're coming in, they're doing show and tell with the society, and they're, all getting very excited, saying, okay, what about this experiment? What about that experiment? Let's go and do a bit more. Once you get that, people who are drawn into that social circle also get the mentality much more easily than they would otherwise, right?
This is a wonderful example of something happening in society. You managed Mr. Horton's newsletters before, and all of a sudden this kind of economic knowledge, which of course was always disseminated, there were always merchants who were interested in what's the price of this and what does he do with that commodity, but it was not aggregated, it was not systematized, it wasn't nationwide, it was localized, and it was personalized. And now all of a sudden it becomes a thing in the public sphere. There is this newsletter that everyone can go to. And all of a sudden you perhaps want to argue against that or doubt it or write a letter to it. And therefore you begin to interact with it and see it as a frame of reference. The same happens with the Royal Societies, where the tinkering that did happen everywhere, and perhaps people did invent better spinning wheels in earlier times, but they did die with them. Now, all of a sudden, they take that to a market of ideas and it becomes involved in that. And again, these institutions make this a thing to be talked about, a presence in society that hasn't been there before.
What the printing press, I think, does is, allow them to be public, right? We talk about publications, right? Is, I think, that it's about they're starting to imagine that there's a group of people out there who are kind of anonymous, but they might be potential readers for the works that they're publishing. And I think that public sphere, in which you see in the Low Countries as well, you see it in the Netherlands, but you particularly see it in England and the Netherlands. And so there's some great stats that have been collected by people. One of the striking things about printing in England versus in other countries is that London as a printing centre is overwhelmingly in English, whereas most printing centres throughout Europe are still in Latin until very, very late on. Right, so in England, the switch happens pretty much in the late 16th century. In most other countries, most major printing centres they're going for an international market, which means the international intellectuals, which is all in Latin. And then there's a few things that are in the vernacular, but rarely on the kinds of topics that are important. So in England, very early on, and in the Netherlands as well, you see, but the Netherlands even then is quite a bit more Latin, right? You see this kind of mass market for for useful knowledge very, very early on, which ordinary people, can potentially read. And maybe it's, they can't afford the book themselves and they get it secondhand from someone, or they got a rich neighbor who lends it to them or allows them to visit their library and read it, that kind of thing. But when you look at kind of the kinds of people who are even authors of some of these books, they're not necessarily from dramatically wealthy backgrounds, genteel backgrounds. In the late 16th century, we've got works on navigation written by practicing mariners, practicing navigators, and not just mathematicians. They're probably getting some funding from people who are interested, kind of backers, kind of venture capitalists, if you like. But they are writing for a public audience pretty early on. And I think, so if there's a why Europe, it's probably that the printing press makes a big deal. And if there's a why Britain, the answer, I think, is that public sphere emerges very, very early on. And part of the reason for that, I believe, at least this is kind of the argument that I've been developing, is that unlike in the rest of Europe, you don't have a particularly wealthy state or monarch, let's say a court, which is willing to fund this stuff. But you do have quite a lot of people who are merchants, who are, even gentlemen with quite a bit of money to invest. And very early on, people cotton on that they can write to that kind of public. They can appeal to this small group of potential investors rather than focusing all on one person, the monarch, who may or may not be interested. England in the 16th century is like the English court, the English crown, is incredibly short of funds all the time.
Which is really fascinating because a friend of mine always makes the point that great cultural innovations usually come from the periphery. They don't come from the great civilizational center, which is probably already quite saturated and does things that work and therefore doesn't have to do things differently. But they come very often, the innovative people, but also the new sort of structures come from the periphery. And Northern England, in your description, was that periphery at the time. Culture was happening elsewhere.
Yeah, England as a whole, yeah. And then later Northern England, so in the 18th century, we can talk about this shift of industry northwards. In a way, yes, London and the southeast become saturated in some ways. You do start to see problems with guild restrictions that maybe are having a bit of an impact. And people move to places like Birmingham, they move to places like Manchester, they move to Lancashire, they move to further north. There's quite a lot of industry that starts to spring up in Northumberland, and then even later still in Scotland. The north of industry, the north of England and Scotland, and what had been peripheries even within England become the new centres of industry. Because often they have the natural resources. There's a great deal of work that goes into making them places, using infrastructure building, making them places that can become very, very wealthy and become kind of the beating heart of England's economy.
How important is capital in this question? Or perhaps the institutions of capitalism? Because, this is not my area, but what I've read about arguments on, for instance, why ancient Rome didn't industrialize. They had all the basic technology for building something like steam engines, and so they could have done that. They had manufacturing. They had quite concentrated manufacturing, but what I read was that they didn't have the capital structures for investment in these things. And that wasn't seen as a social value to do that. It was also socially not hugely well regarded to be a manufacturer of something. Your social energies would go elsewhere if you were ambitious. And so basically these opportunities went begging. I don't know whether you would agree with that, but it does raise the question of what role does money, what role does investment, what role does the security of property play in this enormous burst of innovation?
I think capital has a great deal to do with it. I'm not sure, you mentioned institutions of capitalism. I'm not really sure. The more I've studied this, the less certain I am of what capitalism actually means as a concept. But let's talk about capital. Let's talk about investment. I think it's hugely important. I don't know much about the ancient Roman example either, but I can tell you what happens in Britain at the time. Is in the 1550s, you do see the creation of institutions that allow you to pool capital from across a lot of people. You see this in the Low Countries as well. And in many ways, it's actually copied from what's happening in Italy, what's happening in Germany, what's happening in the Netherlands. Like patents are basically adopted from Venice to England, right? The institution of how you have this temporary monopoly. Venetians have been doing it since the late 15th century, even earlier, actually, technically. I mentioned, there are patents in the Holy Roman Empire at the same time as there are in England, but they're not that much used in England until suddenly there's this real spate of them in the mid-16th and late 16th centuries. And part of the reason for that is they come up with this new, slightly different way of doing things, which is that they combine the kind of pooling of capital that you might see from merchants to create a corporation which will invest that capital on their behalf. And often the basis of that corporation is a patent monopoly over a certain technique, right? So they're setting up companies around patents. Companies aren't seemingly actually existing at all independent of patents at the time. Some of those companies are created by royal charter because in order to get the monopoly patent in the first place, you need to have, that comes from the monarch. But it's a very cheap way of the monarch to do some industrial policy and even maybe get some money out of it, right? By being a kind of, they get their shares just for having done the legal side of things, if you see what I mean. Where they can say, I'll give you an example, 1560s, they try to introduce a German fuel-saving device for salt making. And so the monarch, grants a patent, and then an incorporation kind of is set up around them, who end up being called the Lords of the Salt Patent. In a lot of the correspondence that we see, it's never mentioned in any histories because it seems to have failed pretty quickly. Right, we're not entirely sure what happened.
But it's a lovely title.
It's a lovely title, the Lords of the Salt Patent, and many of them are aristocrats, right? Aristocrats who are looking for an investment. So yes, I think that's really important. And what's also striking, I think, is one thing that happens in the 1550s is that there are a bunch of very successful investments, and success breeds success. And I think this could have happened where you have these institutions being created and they all fail miserably, everyone loses their money and they never try it again, right? I think the crucial thing is they do it and there's some really big successes. And the most important success, I think, is that they have a company set up in 1553 that sets out, they get a monopoly over new discoveries. So new trade routes and newly discovered lands. And they set off in search of a route to China and Japan via the northeast. So they're going to go round Scandinavia and then they go over the North Pole or kind of, right round into the Arctic Circle. They have a theory that the North Pole itself is actually quite warm. So the ice is kind of a ring around it. But then maybe there's a kind of route that gets them to Asia, where they can, which is meant to be a major market for broadcloth. They think, look, if Japan is kind of at the same latitude as Britain, therefore they must have exactly the same wants and needs, and we can sell our broadcloth to the Japanese, right? So that's what they do. They send off a bunch of ships, which is an extremely expensive thing to do, right? To send off ships into the unknown is like building a space shuttle and just letting it off and just like hoping it comes back eventually, maybe in a few years, and you won't even know, So they send it off. And they accidentally discover the White Sea, which they weren't expecting, and they discover a direct route to the Tsardom of Muscovy. And so that company later becomes known as the Muscovy Company, but they open a pretty valuable trade route, importing furs and various other things that are, spices and so on, coming up overland from Iran or Persia, right, through Russia's growing empire. This is, the court of Ivan the Terrible, right, Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, through all the way up to the White Sea. They set up the port, which has now become Archangel, which is precisely for that English trade. And they have a big success. They actually make quite a bit of money off the Muscovy Company. And I think that makes a big difference because they then very quickly started doing more of this kind of thing. Often the exact same investors, right? They start having companies that start going northwest. The Muscovy company tries to send even more expeditions. Northeast doesn't find very much, frankly, because they keep getting to the Kara Sea, very, very far north, and just they have to turn back because of ice. They send people overland to try and see if they can get a direct trade deal with the Shah of Iran. There's all of this amazing activity, and they're also doing things like bringing copper smelting to Britain. Britain has loads and loads of copper ore. It just didn't have the technology to actually exploit it. But the Germans know exactly what they're doing when it comes to copper, and so they bring over a bunch of Germans. Basically, there's a kind of Augsburg-based consortium because in Augsburg they really know what they're doing. It's the kind of the empire's mint, and you think of the thuggers and all these other great. The rich men of the 16th century are all based around Augsburg, but with an office in Italy and an office in Antwerp in the Low Countries. So they bring over these technicians, and they teach them basically how to do copper smelting. They teach them how to do brass making. They create whole new industries, which again are pretty successful. They have their unsuccessful ones, like the salt making pattern, which I mentioned, seems to sort of just vanish without a trace. Unclear actually what the issue is. I haven't been able to get to the bottom of it yet, even though I've looked in quite a lot of detail into it. But they have a whole bunch of things that are very successful, and I think that success breeds success, right? So once you see that you can once venture capitalists effectively, early modern venture capitalists realize that they can make money off invention becomes something that's worthwhile to do. And it's not so much that you have a culture of aristocrats investing in this stuff, and it's just that France doesn't have that. It's seen as lowbrow. I think a lot of people would have seen it just as lowbrow at the time as well. It's that once that one aristocrat who you did manage to convince does invest and does make a huge amount of money,
and builds himself a new country house,
and builds himself a whole new country house, exactly, then you go, okay, this is actually maybe worthwhile having a go at myself, and that's the kind of the thing that happens.
And just to conclude, let me pitch one word at you that usually sets historians screaming and running away. Are we talking about mentality here? Are we talking about a new way of looking at the world that is emerging at this point, and that becomes a crucial agent in enacting this industrial, scientific, and social change that becomes what we call the modern world? It's such a dangerous word. It's so ill-defined. It's a word that has been, hugely overused and therefore been put in the icebox for a while.
I'm happy to address it head on. I think yes. Well, I'll couch it in some ways. A lot of my story is actually about material factors, right? But material factors do have a very direct impact on the way that people think about things, right?
And the other way around, arguably.
And the other way around, right? But the more likely you are to have, successes from invention, the more that invention becomes an idea that people start talking about and start promoting. If risk-taking, pays off, you might actually get a kind of mentality or culture around risk-taking being a good thing that we ought to be trying to encourage. And then that builds on itself. You do get, I think, a lot of the problem we have with the way we look at history is we kind of neglect what you might call flywheels, where once the momentum starts going, it actually can keep speeding up because one factor reinforces another. That's very, very difficult to unpick. And one of the reasons that I think it's kind of exciting to see someone like Joel McKeer win the Nobel Prize, to bring it back to that, is that a lot of his story is one of those stories. It's about a kind of acceleration from once it starts spinning, it just keeps going and going and going, getting faster and faster, and we're still living through it.
Look at the present. We're living in one of those moments where things start spinning, and we are just exposed to the centrifugal forces without knowing what will start to give and where this is spinning to. Why would it have been different in other periods of history? It was certainly less fast because technological development was less fast. But I think those centrifugal forces of history have always been a great constant.
Yeah, and that spinning could have happened at other periods, but it never quite got fast enough, right, to kind of get its own momentum and just keep going.
Yes, and this is the neuralgic point at which we are both working, which we are both fascinated by. What does make a turning point in history? Why things begin to work differently if the material conditions were not so different? Why a whole new way of looking at the world can be developed? I mean, it does take us to today, but listen, it was really fascinating to get a few insights into, first of all, how much earlier really we have today the Industrial Revolution, but also what are the factors that went into making them into the unique moment they are. Anton, I hope this is not the last time we speak. It's fun to speak to you. It would be great if we had another conversation at some point. If you have something that you want to discuss,
That was a lot of fun.
you're always welcome to get in touch. That would be really fun.
Let's do it.
Thank you very much for being on the BlomCast, and thank you all for listening to this and for spreading the good news. The BlomCast is growing, and as you know, my firm intention is to take over the world. When you look at the competition, I'm not such a bad bet. So thank you for this episode, and see you the next time.